I'm here in the churchyard of St Botolph's Church in Stowlonger, Cambridgeshire. And this is the village where I grew up and where I spent my childhood playing in the fields round about. And whilst the church itself is not architecturally particularly interesting, there is one aspect of it which is absolutely unique. And that's this doorway here behind me. Dating from the late 12th century, the chevron design around the outside belies its Norman origins. But the part of it that is particularly interesting and unique is the tympanum, the part inside the semicircular archway, depicting a mermaid and two wild beasts. This medieval tableau depicts a slightly crude, two-dimensional mermaid in the moment of being assailed by two wild beasts. The left-hand monster could perhaps be a wolf, or a fox, or maybe a dog, though its cloven hooves or claws suggest something more dangerous. The beast on the right, however, is striking a heraldic posture. It has a feline mane, the ears of a cat, and yet stands like a horse. They are characters acting out a story. The question is, what is the story, and who are the protagonists? To my knowledge, though, no one has yet identified the legend it depicts. More likely, I think, is that it is a scene from the imagination of the stone carver. But fascinatingly, the mermaid is a pagan symbol denoting lust and sin. And whilst in church interiors we have many examples of carvings of mermaid, particularly on wooden furnishings, but on the exteriors of churches, this is absolutely unique and the only one that I know of in the whole of England. So it therefore poses two teasing questions. Firstly, what is a pagan symbol doing on a building of Christian worship? And secondly, what is its significance here, 3 days' walk away from the sea? Now, neither of these are questions that we can answer with any authority, but just possibly the dedication of this church, St Botolph, can give us a clue. We have few details about the life of Botolph, and those that we have were written around 400 years after his death by an 11th century monk, Folcard. However, what is reasonably certain is that he and his brother Adulph were Saxon nobles living in East Anglia in the 7th century. They were sent to a Benedictine Abbey in France for their education, and Adulph later became a bishop in Holland, whilst Botolph returned to England. I've travelled today to Icon in Suffolk, and it was here on the banks of the River Ald that in 654 Botolph began to build his monastery. There's nothing left of the monastery today, but in its place stands this fine medieval church. Here behind me is the River Ald, curving in a great oxbow around the site of Icon. Almost entirely surrounded by the oxbow of the River Ald, it's hard to imagine a more remote place, especially in the 7th century. So why would Botolph have built his monastery here? Perhaps it was to isolate the community from the rest of the world. In such case, they could hardly have found a more suitable place. Composting vegetable matter beneath the water and therefore in the absence of oxygen produces methane, phosphine and diphosphine, the principal components of marsh gas. Phosphine spontaneously combusts in contact with oxygen, producing the phenomena we know as will-o'-the-wisp. In Saxon times, the marshes were quite likely haunted by these will-o'-the-wisps, and stories would have abounded of how these marshes were inhabited by demons. Whoever lived here, however, would have needed more than just the grace of God to keep the spirits at bay, the demons at arm's length, and the sirens from invading. It is easy, therefore, to see how local legends and folk tales could have circulated. Botolph remained at Icanhoe as its abbot until his death in 680, and he was buried in the monastery by his disciples. 2 centuries later, however, the monastery was destroyed by Danish invaders, and Botolph's remains were removed for safekeeping. Probably they were first taken to Burr near Woodbridge, but we also know that in 1020 King Nut authorised for them to be taken to the abbey at Bury St Edmunds. In later years, some of his relics were sent to Thorney Abbey near Peterborough, whilst his skull was dispatched to Ely Cathedral. Other body parts were conveyed from place to place. In particular, it seems they were taken to London, including to Westminster Abbey. At some time, probably before the Norman Conquest, Botolph was elevated to being the patron saint of travellers. Why travellers? Well, the only answer that I'm able to find is that, rather than from any fame as a traveller throughout his lifetime, it was for the peregrinations of his remains that he acquired the accolade. It doesn't seem entirely convincing, and I would love to find some other explanation, but if it exists, it is not forthcoming. There are about 70 churches in East Anglia dedicated to St Botolph, and they share one thing in common, that they are often located at the site of what would have been the entrance gate of medieval cities, as if their function was to welcome the traveller. Behind me is the Church of St Botolph's in Cambridge, and when it was built it stood at the gate to the medieval city. So what then of St Botolph's in Stowlonger? It turns out that the church stands on the side of an old drover's road. In days gone by, shepherds drove their flocks, probably from Northamptonshire and Leicestershire, along this lane towards London. In the late Middle Ages, however, the legend of St Christopher, helping a young child to ford a river by carrying him on his shoulders, gained in popularity, and Christopher was also made the patron saint of travellers, eclipsing poor Botolph out of a job. But let us then return to the carving on the tympanum on the doorway in Stowlonger. In the light of what we now know of Botolph's life, can we attach any further significance to it? We have no evidence of it even being connected with the life of St Botolph at all, but the presence of a mermaid makes a convincing argument for it being so. Perhaps the carving on the tympanum at St Botolph's in Stowlonger illustrates some Saxon folk tale about Botolph taming the wild beasts emerging from the River Ald. We can only guess.